In this video, we're going to reverse engineer a scanned Fender in Fusion 360. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to take a scan of a 1976 Fiat Spider Fender, and we're going to try to recreate this using forms. Now, we've talked about reverse engineering before. We did it with the dashboard component, the center console piece from a Dodge, and we've also taken a look at mesh bodies. But this one's a little bit different because we're going to try to recreate the Fender, and it's going to be a little bit tricky for a few different reasons. One of the reasons always comes down to the quality of the scan. Now, the scan looks pretty good, but when we hide the edges, you can see there's a lot of wrinkles in it, and you can see that there's some areas of concern where we don't have good detail of the headlight bucket. So we're going to do our best to try to recreate this. It's going to take a little bit of extra work to go the final mile, but what we're going to focus on in this video is going to be getting the shape, the overall shape of this, because the intent here is to reproduce this as a fiberglass part that can bolt onto the car. And this is a race car application, so we don't really need it to be perfect. We're not looking for perfect seam gaps or anything like that, but we want to replicate the shape. We want to make sure that we can recreate what's here in terms of the details. Now, the first thing I look at with something like this is first the quality of the scan that we're working with. If we have a really detailed high quality scan, it's much easier for us to just pull a form body down to it with a high resolution. Because we don't have that, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pulling a few points, and then we're going to use our best judgment. And when we do this, we're going to be using the forms to sort of mimic and lay on that shape. Now, a couple things that we need to look at are going to be the seam that we see here. You can see the shadow where it changes from dark to light in the front and light to dark in the back. That's going to be not a crease, but it's going to be a detail or a body line that we want to make sure that we carry forward. And obviously the fender flare sort of goes away down in this section. Now, a lot of these older cars, you're going to find there'll be seams or panels or pieces where different pieces get bolted or welded together for different reasons. And you can see that we're missing some scan data on the inside. We're going to have to make some best guesses. And again, the main intent here is for us to replicate the shape, and then we can sort of go forward from there. Now, I will also say that this came from a subscriber, and when he sent this over, he said I could share the scan. So because it's harder to get the mesh file to you, you can go to the description in the video and you can download the Fusion data set with the scan already in it, and it's already sort of set up in this orientation. Now that we've sort of got that all out of the way, let's talk about first steps, because there's a right way and a wrong way to bring in scan data. Now, with anything in Fusion 360, when you have a Parasolid or you have an IGES or a step file, oftentimes you just upload it to your data panel and then open the design. However, with mesh data, that's actually not going to be a good way to do it. And the main reason is anytime you upload something to the data panel, what you actually end up doing is having that data converted, especially when it's an intermediate format. If you're uploading an OBJ or an STL or an FBX file, some other mesh file, then that's automatically getting converted to a solid or a surface body. And that's going to be the wrong approach when we want to use this mesh data for something like a forms. So the right way to go about doing this is to start a new design, go into your mesh tab and use the insert mesh. Now, in this case, I'm just going to bring this in to show you. Again, you can download the Fusion file that already has this aligned. And the reason that I want to show you this is because this is often the case, especially when you're talking about dealing with hobby or consumer grade scanners and the software that comes with them. One of the big things that you'll notice when you're talking about high-end scanners is there is going to be a high level of precision on the scan data, but there's also going to typically be a high level of data translation and alignment that happens in the scan software. Most of the scanners that you see on the market on the consumer side will come with a free or a watered down version of a mesh manipulator. But when you get to the higher end, you typically will buy a piece of software that can range anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 or more that is specifically made to help translate that mesh data and align it to a coordinate system. That alignment of a coordinate system is a really critical point, especially when dealing with parametric models. With the Fender, we're not as concerned with it, but I did want to at least show you the way that I go about sort of setting this up in Fusion, because it's not really straightforward. So the first thing I want to do is I center it at the origin, and you'll notice it instantly sort of flips around, and that's because the coordinate system just goes back to home view. We can move it to ground, again, home position, and we can also flip the up direction. Now this isn't really going to make much of a difference for us, but just note that we do have these options. I'm going to say OK, and the next step for me is to use the move command, which is M on the keyboard. What I want to do is I want to select this entire body. We need to be mindful of the orientation of the gnomon or the little manipulator that you see on the screen, and make sure that it doesn't change direction when you select a different part of your mesh. Now in this case, I just want to pick somewhere because we're selecting the mesh body. And all I really want to do in this step is I want to try to rotate it to a position that looks like it might be the orientation that we would see on the car. So about 25 degrees, it looks about right, and I'm going to say OK here. Now it's very easy to try to get all of the rotations down in one move command, but the reason I don't do that is because if I do move again, now my coordinate system is realigned with X, Y, and Z, which means because I'm looking at it from this orientation, I can just flip over to this view, and then I can begin rotating it to where I think it's correct. So in this case, it looks like about 35 degrees. Once again, I'm going to say OK. And now you can see that it looks roughly aligned, but I am going to select it again, and I want to rotate this down. I want this to be in approximately the right orientation. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not like I have a picture or a blueprint of the car behind it, but making sure that the orientation of the mesh is correct is really going to help downstream when we start to use our form tools. And the reason is because the form tools, especially the translate manipulator, is based on the coordinate system X, Y, and Z of your design. So if you don't take the time to actually get this in the correct position, then it's just going to be harder downstream. Now, if you have been using forms for a while, you might be saying to yourself, well, that's true, except there are other coordinate system options when we're working with forms. We can rotate and base it on of our selection. And yes, that is true, but it's much easier to just spend a couple minutes getting this in the correct orientation. Now that we know that, let's go ahead and start with the file that I already have set up. So if you're going to follow along, I need to make a few notes here. One, I have not gone through this process on this Fender before. This is going to be the first time, and if I don't use this recording, then so be it. But we're going to go in sort of from scratch how I would approach it. I like to do that with these types of videos because it really helps, at least with me, it helps go through the process how I would approach it. Now, if I went through and I modeled this a dozen times and then presented the video, it's not as realistic. We don't really get those pain points that we get along the way. So I like to do that. I like to start from scratch and at least try the first time I record it is just try it from scratch. And that's where we're at. The second thing is this is probably going to take a good bit of time. I don't really have a good idea of how long it's going to take. It might take half an hour. It might take 4 hours. I don't know. So obviously, if you've clicked on this video, you know exactly how long it's going to take. But just keep in mind that this process, there's no set amount of time that it's going to take. It really depends on the scan quality that you have, the level of detail that you want. So if you're starting with me, let's go ahead and create a form. And the first type of primitive that I'm going to create is the face primitive. I'm going to use the object snap, which automatically gets me away from having to select a plane, and I can snap directly onto the mesh. There is this offset option here, and if I change this offset value, I've never really had great luck with it sort of offsetting correctly. But what I want to do here is I want to be real careful not to start out using a lot of different faces. I want to get just a big broad shape. I want to start there and then divide it up as needed. It's very easy for us to come in and start making a bunch of small faces on here. And if I had a really high quality mesh, I might do that. But when we have issues where we've got these like these different bumps and undulations that happen along the details, then it's not going to be worth your time to really try to get in and match it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on this edge here. I'm going to start right there. I'm going to come all the way to the back. I'm going to come down, and I'm going to come back over. That's my first face, and I'm only going to do 2, so I need to come in here and find that endpoint. I'm going to come up here, come to the back corner, find that other endpoint, and then say OK. So all of that just gave us 2 faces, and you can see that those 2 faces are hidden inside the fender. That's okay. What we're going to do is use the modify edit form. I'm going to select the entire body, and this should give me both of those divisions, and I want to move that out to a situation where it fits. I'm going to move that, and I'm just going to sort of keep it here for now. The reason I just want to keep it here for now is so we can kind of see what we're working with. All right, and then I want to go back in, and I'm going to use modify. I'm going to change this back to the all option, and I'm just going to pull these points back until the corner is just going into that surface. So you can see it's getting close. I'm going to leave it about there. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm just going to pull this back until it gets really close to that surface. Another thing that you want to do is you want to work in box display mode, which you can get to underneath your selection options. You can select it here. If you're on a PC, it's Alt and 1. If you're on a Mac, I believe it's Option and 1. I don't use a Mac, so I'm not exactly sure, but you can go ahead and try that. And again, we're just going to pull these back, get them close to where they start to disappear. Do this. It's always important, if you haven't seen any of the other form videos that we've done, if this is your first introduction into this, I am going to go a little bit quicker through some of it, but it's important that you understand that you should really be working in a single axis or in plane. So when we're looking at the manipulator, this is going to move in X only. This is going to move in Y or Z only in this orientation. And this is going to allow me to move in X and Z. And that's okay. This gives me a little bit finer resolution. If I just select X, it's going to snap every 5 or 10 millimeters, depending on how zoomed in we are. If I get really close, it's going to start snapping at 1 millimeter. But oftentimes that doesn't work. So using this can be really helpful to just kind of get it close. And we'll do the same thing here. Get it close until about the point where it disappears. Rotate around and do the same thing here. And using the manipulator where we're in plane can be really helpful because now I don't have to worry about getting completely in this back orientation. And again, there are other coordinate space options that we can use, but if we use the selection space, then you'll notice the coordinate system is based on the normal direction of that surface, and that's really not helpful for us to lay out a complex shape like this. All right, so here we're pretty much done, right? The thing looks exactly like the original Fender, but obviously we need to do quite a bit more work. So the way that we're going to go about this is I'm going to double click this back edge. I'm going to go to modify and I'm going to insert an edge. And again, if you're just kind of starting out, when you do an insert edge or a subdivision, you have 2 options, simple and exact. Simple will put that edge exactly where you tell it. In this case, 0.5, which is halfway between that selected edge and the next edge on the form body. If we use exact, it'll insert the edge where we want. However, it might subdivide the rest of it because exact will maintain the exact shape of the form that we're dealing with. So if you get a shape that's really close to what you want and you need to divide it up more, using the exact option can be helpful. In this case, we're just starting, so simple is what we're going to do. I'm going to select it. I'm going to go to modify, and actually I'm going to just take the points like we were doing before, and I'm going to pull that point out. Again, trying to get it relatively close. This one's going to kind of come up and out until we can kind of see it. Now, again, you might be thinking, why don't we just go in and start pulling this down to the mesh? If we've done this before, then you'll know that we do have commands that allow us to pull those vertices to the mesh. And again, it really comes down to the resolution of the mesh that you're working with. In this case, because we are dealing with a hobby level scanner, this is something that you would see if you're using an Xbox Connect sensor or photogrammetry. This is actually a really good result for a sub $20,000 scanner. This is something that you would see on the higher end of the consumer or hobby grade scanners. This also could just be a really good scan and the Fender might have a lot of imperfections in it. And if that's the case, obviously we're not trying to perfectly replicate imperfections. But again, it's as common of what you would see if you were doing sort of a hobbyist scan. All right, so the intent here for us is to replicate the big surfaces as closely as possible. Now, at this point, we could jump into smooth display. And if I hide the mesh, you can kind of see what we're working with here. Everything looks really smooth on the smooth display. And when we go back to our box display, this is really the control cage that's defining that smooth shape. So you can kind of see this edge and this edge out here. The result is going to be this smooth curve underneath. So again, we're going to continue to work in box display, but we want to make sure that we just jump back and forth. Get comfortable with using those shortcut keys. I also like to use Control on a PC, Control and 4 to hide the edges, and Control and 6 to bring them back. I'm going to do that quite a bit, go back and forth between smooth and box display and hiding and showing those edges. So at this point, we have a lot of work to do. All right, so what I want to do is I want to start to get these points close to that edge. So I want to kind of bring that up. I want to find the next one here. I want to get this up. And if I need to rotate around, I can pull that back a little bit. Once we get those in position from our side view sort of vertically, then we want to stop moving them around in plane, and we really want to focus on just moving them in one direction. So once I get this up about the right position, I want to focus on just moving it in X. So we're going to pull that back, and that looks pretty good. This is going to take, again, it's going to take some time to get used to this process. Once again, this is the first time I'm going through this. So I'm taking a little bit of extra time, just kind of moving things around, manipulating it, because spending the time getting this original shape as close as possible is going to mean that downstream, you're going to save yourself a lot of work. You're not going to get a bad surface, so you have to put in the time now. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on this mid line here, and I'm going to go to Insert Edge. This time I'm going to use Simple, but I want to use the Both option. And again, I'm going to put it right in the middle of both edges. The main reason that we want to stick with that 0.5 whenever possible is because the best result, the best surface quality you're going to get is when you have a consistent layout of these edges. So again, we're going to go to Modify, Edit Form, and I'm going to rotate this around. We know that that's at roughly the right height, so we're going to just begin pulling it out till we can see it. We'll do the same thing over here, rotate around and pull it out till we can see it. Now, at this point, we've got some other edges here. We need to pull those up until we can see them. Not too concerned with this edge just yet, but we want to just make sure that we are still working on this and manipulating this. The surfaces in here we're not quite ready to deal with just yet, so I'm going to leave them as is. It's also a good idea for us to save often, so let's just pause and do a quick save, make sure that we do have everything we need. All right, so I think it's probably also important that we note that this is not the only way to do this. So we talked about in the 911 series that there's a couple of different ways that you can get started. You can use curves. So for example, let's just take a quick detour and let's start a sketch. And we're going to use a spline. So if we know that this is going to be the curve that we're trying to recreate, what we can do is we can create a spline and we can extrude that out. So from our create menu, we've got extrude. We can take that spline and we can pull it out. Now, the issue that you get here is that in order to match the curvature, we really want to use the uniform option, and it just adds a lot of divisions very early on. So, if you know the curvature that you're working with, this can be a good option to get started. And then we can come back and we can use modify and insert point. And we can come through here, selecting the different points. Now the red dots are midpoints, and we likely don't want to use midpoints, but we can work our way back, and this is not going to be the method that we're going to use for this, but we can work our way back. And once we're here, then we can take this outside edge and hit delete. And what that ends up leaving us with is that sort of curve. And what we do from there is we go to modify and we hold down Alt and we extrude that down. And you can instantly see the problem that we get here is when we go back to box display, that looks pretty good. And then we're going to end up deleting that original piece. And this leaves us with a surface that should be relatively close to the fender. But because this fender sort of rolls around, what ends up happening is we're going to need to trim this back a little bit more. So we'd have to insert an edge, and really it's going to be up here pretty far up. And then we're going to get rid of this. So it is a valid method. This can be a really good method to create something like this. And once you've done this enough and you've had some experience with creating these form bodies, I think this is a wonderful way to get started in a lot of cases. However, as we're beginning and as we're learning, I think taking it one step at a time and understanding that we're starting with the big face and we're breaking it up into smaller pieces and then we're sort of working out from there. I think that is really important. And once you have that concept down, once you work with that, then you can really start to explore some of these other options. Now, at this point in time, what I want to do is I want to go back to smooth display, and I really want to drive the point home that the control frame that we're creating in box display is a lot further out than the control frame in smooth display. Now, that is okay, but we should be mindful of the fact that this edge, once we go into smooth display, has moved pretty far down. Now, initially, what we wanted to do is we wanted it to be up here, but when it translates this geometry from the box cage to the smooth display, it takes some liberties and it starts to move things around. So before I get too much further, I'm going to go to make uniform. I'm going to say, okay, I want to find that edge. I'm going to double click on it and go back to a right view. And with that edge selected, I'm going to go to box display and then back to my smooth display, and I'm going to see where that is. And you can see that it's pretty low. It's not going to get pushed back up there. It's a little bit closer, but it's not going to get pushed back up there until we start adding some additional edges to help control that, or we move it in the smooth display. So you can really take any approach you want. The box display, it's kind of where we want it. And generally, that's the approach that I would take. I would say really focus on the box display and don't worry about the smooth display until you're ready for some of the final detailing, because we can make the minor tweaks then. But if you're playing around with this and you're going back and forth between smooth and box display, you will notice that those edges are not going to be where you left them. So just keep that in mind. It's not a perfect one-to-one translation. So you do kind of need to think about that we are going to end up moving things around. And with that in mind, I want to take these edges and I'm going to raise them up a little bit. So I'm going to grab each one and just sort of pull them up so that they're just kind of above that mesh. We can start to see them a little bit more. And it just kind of helps us visualize it a little bit better. Again, we are going to be moving things around quite a bit. So now that we have this part of it, I would really caution you against dividing it up more to match the curvature of the fender just yet. And the reason being is because we have a lot of work to do down here. We still haven't done anything with the wheel arch. We haven't rolled up above the top of the fender. So there's still quite a bit to do. So I'm going to start by selecting this. I'm going to insert an edge. I'm going to go back to single. This time I'm not going to go halfway. I'm going to stick this up a bit closer to that edge. The number doesn't really matter. 0.15 looks like it's about right. And then I'm going to take that entire edge. I'm going to take a look at this from the front. I'm going to take that entire edge, because remember when we use the simple insertion mode, it's not going to care about the shape. All it's going to do is insert it exactly in between the upper edge and the lower edge of our selection. And that means that essentially these are going to be in a straight line, and that's not what we want. We never want to have an edge in a completely straight line, because that means that it's really not doing anything. So I'm going to take that entire edge, pull it out, and then I need to work on individual vertices, pulling them out. Again, what we're looking to do is get it relatively close. You might need to use the in-plane option. I'm going to pull this one out a little bit. And you can kind of see where I put that edge is hitting just above the transition for the little lip of that flare. And that's exactly where I want it to be in the box display, because that's where we're going to start to divide up and flare this out. So that is planned. And then we're just going to move these back. And also note that at this point, we haven't used any of the tools to actually pull these to the mesh. We're just building it out manually. So it really is helpful to understand that we can do this without a high quality scan. It's not ideal by any means. I mean, ideally, we would want a nice high quality scan. But if you don't have access to that technology, then you still have options. You can still get something that is a decent result. Now, before I go too much further, I'm going to hide the mesh and I'm going to go to a smooth display. I'm going to hide the edges, again, Control and 4. I just want to look at the results so far. Now, everything looks nice and smooth. We don't have any waves or bumps. It is rolling down a bit here, but we haven't really done anything. But that looks pretty good, so I'm pretty happy with the results so far. Oftentimes, you'll find that you end up getting some waves or some bumps if you start by creating a bunch of faces and try to manipulate it, which is really why I think it's important that we start with one big face. We divide it in half and we start to create the shape in the middle, and then we divide it again and work from there. Again, ideally, the least number of divisions is what you want. And I'm just going to continue to work my way down, inserting edges. And again, I'm going to just put them at about, roughly the same 0.15 to 0.2, somewhere in there, because I'm looking to keep this fairly consistent. Then I'm going to take that entire edge once more, and I'm going to pull it out to try to match the fender. And don't worry about the flare part just yet. We're just worried about the general shape. And once I pull that entire thing out, then I'm going to go back to each of these vertices and begin pulling them back in plane. And if we make some mistakes, we can always erase edges. We can select an entire edge. So for example, if I decided I didn't want this, I can select the entire edge and just hit delete and then go backwards. So I'm going to leave it in there, Control Z to undo. But just keep in mind, we're not stuck. We're not fixed with what we do. It is destructive. It is direct modeling, but we can still make these changes. And I'm going to just keep following that process. I'm going to keep inserting edges. Now, I could do this by inserting it at half, getting that part down there adjusted. But in this case, I actually like to work down the fender and just work sort of one segment at a time. I'm going to pull this entire thing out, get it relatively close. And then again, I'm just going to manipulate each vertice as I see fit. And I'm just kind of looking for it to be peeking through the mesh. Again, I'm not too worried about what's happening in here. I just want to make sure that we are matching the shapes that we have available. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out just a little bit, push this one back. And that looks pretty good. And again, the intent here, this is for a race car to create a fiberglass fender. And it doesn't have to be exact, which is why we can sort of make, we can kind of make do with a less than ideal scan, because we're not trying to perfectly match something. We're trying to get it close. We want it to look right. But ultimately what we can do is we're going to have some options to adjust the flare to account for wider wheels, or to make some clearances for adjustment and suspension, things like that. But we're just going to keep working with this. Note that we will have to come back and tweak things once we get the flare portion in, but I'm just trying to work my way down and get the rough shape. So let's go ahead and move this and we'll pull that back. Looks pretty good. I say okay, and then we're going to insert another edge. So again, we started really large with the entire fender being one big piece, and we're working our way down, adding the curvature. And this is going to give us a fairly clean result. Just going to go ahead and pull that out. This point in the middle probably needs to come way out, and this one needs to start to go back. So let's go ahead and pull that one back, and we're almost done, getting pretty close. And let's just add probably 2 more edges. Now keep in mind that this number is a percentage, so 0 is going to be right on that edge, and 1 is going to be on the next edge in the chain. So we're looking at a percentage between them. So you want to make sure that you do this visually, because now you can see that that 0.15, 0.2, that number has been getting larger and larger as we go down, because we're getting further and further, the percentage is larger, the distance between those two edges. So keep in mind that you don't really stick with just that number, but you're going to have to sort of play around with that. And let's go ahead and pull this one out as well. And then here it's going to go back. And here it's going to go back as well. So once again, the intent in this video is not to completely recreate this, but we're just looking at the process. And at this point, I mean, this is probably the hardest part, is getting this started. So if you've made it this far, then good for you. I know we're about 30 minutes in, so I'll probably end up breaking this up into multiple videos because it is quite a bit. All right, so we just added one more edge. It already looks okay. I'm going to take this entire edge and sort of pull it out, and then maybe make some adjustments back here at this point. Now, as we're looking at the divisions of this fender, really what we want to think about is where those divisions of those faces are going to end up. So I'm going to go back to a right-hand view. I'm going to save it so I don't lose anything. But right now, everything is just sort of going down vertically. And what we really want is we want to figure out a way to incorporate the flare. Now, we haven't done the flare part yet. And obviously, we're going to have to make some sort of guesses as to what happens to the fender down here. And we're going to have to make some adjustments back here. But let's take a quick look at our results. And I'm going to hide the edges. Now, you can see that in the middle, things got really weird. All right. Things got really weird in the middle because we didn't really care what was going on. We didn't have any references in the middle. And ultimately, what's going to happen is we're going to divide this thing up for the fender. So I don't really care that things got sort of bumpy in the middle. Really, what I'm looking to do is control these outsides. And again, it's just a starting point. We can always delete edges and come back and make changes if we need to. But right now we have a pretty high resolution in terms of the number of edges. The only thing I want to do is I'm going to take this upper edge and I'm going to start to extrude it across the top. So I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to sort of bring this up. I'm going to let go and do Alt again and bring this over. Now, as I do that, you can see that we're starting to run into a problem because the shape changes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset my pivot point to this back corner. And then I'm going to use rotate. I'm going to rotate that edge. And then I need to actually move that whole edge in just a little bit. And I'm going to rotate it some more. All right, so I'm going to rotate it back probably 1 or 2 degrees. Let's go 2. And 2 looks pretty good. And it looks okay. And that means that this one in the middle is probably not okay. So I'm going to select it and delete it. And then I'm going to double click on this edge. I'm going to insert an edge. And one of the benefits of doing this is because even though these are at different angles, it's going to be exactly in the middle. So it's going to give me a nice division. Then I can take that, modify edit form, and I can pull it up. But if it's okay in the back here, then really what I want to do is I'm going to set the pivot point back here. And then because this curves down, I can actually scale this vertically and it'll start to pull the entire thing up and it'll be nice and gradual as we rotate around. It looks okay. And then I'm going to start to pull these points down. So I'm just going to take this down, take this one down, and this one probably up just a little bit. And I think that'll be okay for now. We can make some manual tweaks and adjustments as needed, but it's probably a little too soon for that. I just wanted to sort of get the rest of that shape. So if we take a look at it, we're starting to roll around the fender. We still haven't worried about the detail, the edges. Those are things that we're going to have to add additional edges to help control. But right now we're just looking at the sort of the rough shape. Okay, so at this point, the next step for me is going to be to create this lip. And I'm going to do that with a cylinder. I'm going to select the right plane and just draw a cylinder that's approximately the right size. And on this, I've noticed recently that the numbers in the dialog for the cylinder are not working very well. So I'm going to manually increase that to 16. You can see height faces, it says 1, but it actually was previewing 4. So what I want to do is I only want one face there. And I'm going to change the height of this because it doesn't need to be that thick. It only needs to be a really thin cylinder. And I'm going to say OK. Then we're going to use Modify, Edit Form. I'm going to select the body option. I'm going to pull this out where it needs to be. So what I'm looking to do is I want to put that roughly where the lip would be right there. And when I rotate this around, obviously you can see that the shape is wrong. But because we're dealing with a cylinder, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to scale it down vertically and see if I can get that shape to be roughly right. And you can see as I'm doing this, it looks like it's getting pretty close up here. And the rest of it we're going to have to sort of flare out, and that's okay. So I'm going to say okay to that. And then I want to get rid of these faces on the bottom. So everything that's below here, actually, you know what? Everything that is below that, because that can be pulled forward. Actually, you know what? We'll manually build that. So I'm going to get rid of everything under here. We can do this with a box selection, but I'm just going to manually select it, and I'm going to hit delete on the keyboard. I want to make sure to turn this into box display because now we have two form bodies. We have to manually select them. And as we look at this, again, we want to keep some consistency. So what we're looking to do is we're looking to keep a consistency in the distance between these edges, and that is going to make a big difference for us. So I'm going to take this outside edge. I'm going to pull it out just a little bit. Remember, this is the box display. And I'm going to pull this back until it's just about right. And then I'm going to move my pivot point to the top. And then I want to start to rotate this. Now, that's going to get me pretty close on some of this, but the way that the shapes of these cars work out is that I'm going to box select these vertices, and actually it's probably not going to let me, so I'm going to manually select the one on the other side as well. Actually, the back one looks okay. Just this front one looks to roll in a bit more. So I'm going to pull that back. And then this one down here gets pulled back quite a bit. But notice that the actual inside edge is here. So I'm going to pull that back a little bit first. Then I'll pull this back. Then we'll rotate around. And the back looks okay. Probably could be pulled out a little bit. I'm going to find the other point here and pull that out a little bit. And that looks okay. So on the actual car, most cars, at least most newer cars, will have a flat section here. This car looks like it has pretty much a roll that happens right away. What I'm going to do is I'm going to double click that outside edge. I want to move my pivot point to roughly the center of the wheel. And it's tough because I don't have a blueprint or a picture. So I'm just going to have to manually do this. So we're going to set the pivot point here, but before we OK it, we're going to move it down to roughly where the center of the wheel would be. I think it looks probably about there. And then we're going to hold down Alt, and we're going to begin to extrude this out. Now this is going to go out a very small amount. We can have a manual number here, 1.01. And doing a small amount like that is going to be harder for us in the short term, but in the long term, that's going to help us control that corner. And then from the front view with that edge still selected, I'm going to go back to Modify and Edit Form. And I'm going to do an Alt, and I'm just going to start to pull this back. And this is going to take a little bit of manipulation, but that's going to start to give me that upper section of the flare. And then I can start to manipulate the rest of the geometry from here. And you can already see that it gives me roughly the right shape, but I think I need to scale it outward. And then I'm going to have to take some of these points and manually adjust them. You have to find this front point here, probably pull it forward a little bit. And ideally what you want when you're dealing with a shape like this is you want these edges to point toward the center of the wheel. And that's going to kind of give you the best chance at the geometry that you want. So I'm going to have to make some manual adjustments here. I'm looking to keep the thickness of or the length of these edges roughly the same. And then we're going to have to make some adjustments to these edges because they really need to be outside of the fender, and right now they're way inside the fender. So that's going to have to get pulled out, and this can be done a couple different ways. We can reset our pivot point once again to the top, and we can begin scaling this horizontally, which will pull those forward. And you can kind of see it starting to come out of the fender there. And that's gonna get us relatively close. We are gonna still do a little bit of manual manipulation on these. Anytime that you can use the tools to scale and rotate these edges and these groups of vertices, I strongly suggest it because it's going to give you a better overall result. When you have to start to do things manually like this, you really want to leave a lot of that manual manipulation for some very fine details, and you don't really want to do it for the bigger, broader things. We're kind of forcing the issue here simply because we're going to have to do a lot of manual work to get this shape. But just keep in mind that in general, that's not really what you want to do. I'm going to box select this. I'm going to pull this out a bit and probably box select this. When you box select it, it's going to grab all of the edges here. You can see that we do need to maybe tweak that just a little bit. But when I box select, it's going to grab all the edges, including the ones that go back and inside, which again is important. And then let's just make a little bit of adjustment here. Okay, so if we hide the mesh body for a second and we turn this into a smooth display, we can see that we've got a pretty good result here. That looks pretty good. And if we bring back the other body, you can see that it overlaps it pretty well. So this is giving us a great starting point. But now from here is where it really begins to get tricky. So let's do a quick save. Because now at this point, what we need to do is we need to start dividing this up in a way that we can actually begin to attach these together. So at this point, I want you to be thinking about maintaining 4 sides, and then we also really want to think about ways in which we can connect these. Now, the simplest way to get started is to use insert point, and then we're going to come through and we're going to just start to divide this up. I'm going to start all the way at the bottom because we're going to have to delete everything that's inside of here. So I'm going to start at the bottom roughly here, and I'm just going to begin breaking these up. And for the most part, this is going to work pretty well. However, when we start to cross over a vertical edge, we're going to end up getting triangles. And triangles are not ideal. It's not the end of the world if we have triangles, but anytime you have a triangle, what you actually are doing is you're creating a flat spot. Now, the reason you're creating a flat spot is because when you think about 3 points in space, the only thing that you can really have between those points is going to be a flat. Now, that's kind of the same thing when we end up having a 5-sided face, what's called an n-gon. When we end up with an n-gon, then we're going to end up in a situation where we essentially have flats inside. But now that we have the division taken care of, it's not perfect, but I'm going to change my selection to freeform selection, and I'm going to begin selecting these faces. I'm going to shift select these remaining pieces here, and I'm just going to hit delete on the keyboard. Now, again, this is not perfect, but this is getting us closer. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to extrude it down. So I'm going to hold down Alt. It's going to bring it down. I'm going to reset the pivot point over here. And then I'm going to actually scale this vertically to make it flat. And then just kind of move it up into place. So we're going to worry about fixing that a bit later. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to reset the pivot point and then scale this vertically. Let's go ahead and try that again. Set the pivot point here and scale it vertically to sort of flatten it out. And again, we're going to worry about fixing the geometry there a little bit later. All right, so now inside of here, we've got, let's turn this back into box display. We have got an edge here, and it's kind of meeting right in the middle, and that's not ideal. If we look over here, we've got this extra edge just right in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that and delete it on both sides. And then I'm going to take this edge, I'm going to go to Modify, Slide, and I'm just going to bring it up until it's roughly in the right spot. Whenever we start this process of sort of merging these things together, when we take a look, this whole thing is definitely way out in space. I'm going to go ahead and bring it back until it's roughly in the right spot. And again, we'll make some adjustments to this stuff later. It doesn't have to be perfect right now. But we do want to take a look at the mesh, and we want to kind of see what we see. What is in the right spot? This right here looks like it needs to come out further. This we'll deal with in a bit. I'm going to pull it out just a little bit. But when we look at this, we need to start thinking about putting these points together, and we're going to use weld vertices. And weld vertices, the selection is important. The first point we select is going to move, and the second point is going to stay fixed. So for example, if we want to move the fender over to this point, then we need to make sure we select that second. Same thing here if we want to move that up, and so on. You can see we don't have a point here. I can do it to this one here. We're missing one in the middle. I'll do it here. Now, once we start to do this, what's going to end up happening is we're no longer going to be able to get a smooth display. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to move it up to here. We don't have one in the middle, we don't have one there. This one is kind of in between. I'm going to take it over to here. We don't have one there. This one I'll bring up, this one over, and this one over. So this helps us identify where we potentially need additional edges or divisions, or maybe we've got too many and we can get rid of some. So my suggestion when we have something like this is if we select this edge and delete it, notice that it leaves what looks like a darker edge here. We need to make sure that these edges are actually connected. And we can do that by just going to Modify and starting to pull them, and then doing Control Z and undo. Make sure that, that we are able to undo it. This one here, I'm going to delete it, again, patch it. This one is a lot trickier because we actually do want to make sure that we have the correct number of divisions to get the shape of the fender, and 4 or 3 internal divisions going from front to back, it's going to be kind of important. But what we can do is we can sort of manipulate where those are. Now, on the fender flare itself, we have to be careful because, again, we want the size of each of these faces to be roughly the same for consistency. But what we can do is we can start to move this forward and potentially get the right shape. So something that we have to kind of worry about is what's called a star point. Now, star points are happening anytime we have 3 or 5 or more edges coming together. Now, ideally, what you want is 4 edges coming together, which means we have 4-sided faces on either side. When we have star points, that means that we've got, in this case, we've got 1, 2, and 3 coming together. A star point typically indicates that we have a triangle or an n-gon, so something that has more than 4 sides. Typically 5 sides is what we end up finding. Now, those are kind of a necessary evil, something that we are going to have in pretty much every design, especially if you're changing directions of a shape. However, you don't want them directly next to a transition. So for example, from the fender flare to the fender. So we have to work kind of hard to move them away from the geometry. We're not quite at that point yet, but what I want to do is I'm going to go to Modify, Insert Point, and I'm going to come from here down to here and hit Enter. And then I'm going to take this edge and delete it. And what that does is this makes 4 sides here, 4 sides here, 4 sides here. And then this stuff is kind of messed up a little bit, but you can see that this helps us sort of rectify that issue. We're going to do the same thing over here. Probably not an ideal solution just yet, but we're not quite to the point of doing all the final detail work. So when I delete that again, I want to make sure that these edges are connected. This is not a good result because now we have an n-gon. You can see that the face is kind of broken up inside here because we don't have anything connecting it. So what I'm going to do is Modify and Insert Point. Make sure that we don't have anything selected. I'm going to find that edge, which is here. And I'm just going to break this face up for now. and then use weld vertices. Now, because we are using T-splines, T-splines is essentially the technology behind this, we can have what are called T-points. Now, T-points are when we have, essentially when we have an edge that creates a T and ends in the middle of another edge. Now, T-points, we can actually use insert point, and I can just put a point on an edge, and then I've divided it up. Now, that's not an ideal situation for a couple different reasons. Essentially because it makes the calculations for the control underneath a bit trickier and the geometry ends up suffering. So what we want to do is we want to think long and hard about whether or not we want those. On this back side, I'm going to go ahead and delete these edges, and I'm going to allow it to just create that triangle right there. And you can see that the triangle is open. It hasn't been filled. So I'm going to use Modify, Fill Hole, and just select this and just let it patch it. Again, not ideal, but this is kind of a working process. We want to kind of work through this. So I'm going to try to make this smooth, and it's not going to allow it. So it's got some problems. We're going to just go into Repair Body and see if we can find any problems. Now, there's no major issues that it's finding. The T-point can be converted to a star point. That typically is something that we want to think about. Another thing that we want to think about is this weld tolerance. Now, you can kind of see sometimes we'll have darker edges, and if we increase this weld tolerance, say to 0.1 millimeters, a lot of times it'll be able to weld those edges together. I'm going to make it larger. I'm going to go all the way up to 1 millimeter and see if it can catch anything. And it's not catching anything just yet, so maybe increase it again and see if it'll find anything. It doesn't look like it, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to manually find those things. So again, when you see a darker edge here, that's typically an indication that you have a problem. I'm going to try to use Merge Edge. I'm going to select one and use the Group 2 selection and see if it'll let me select another edge and say OK. And then let's try to convert this to Smooth Display. If it's still not working, then we're going to repeat the process. And you'll find that if there are two edges, you'll be able to do this by simply moving to the Edge Group 2 selection and saying OK. Let's try to convert it to smooth. Still not there. So again, this is still telling me that we've got some potential issues. Let's go ahead and select one of these vertices and see if we can pull it apart. That's fine. Let's grab one over here. That's fine. Let's grab one over here. That seems to be fine. I'm going to go ahead and just grab a couple of these faces and see if we've got any issues that we can find. Everything looks to be okay. So let's try one more time to do Repair Body. Let's let it auto repair. And yeah, so it's still not working around. I'm going to select an edge and hit delete. And I'm going to do the same thing here. And now it's working. So it didn't like those edges, so we're going to fix that by going to Bridge. And I'm going to go 1, 2, and 3 for my first edge selections. And we'll go 1, 2, and 3 for these. And I'm going to make sure the number of faces is 1. You can turn the preview on if you want. And we're going to say OK. Now this should automatically merge the end edges. So I should be able to convert this to a smooth display. And I'm going to use Control 4. So the patches right now are not great. We have a lot of work to do, but it's actually not that far off from the mesh display. So we can see the mesh display. We can see the underlying surface. It's actually not too bad, but we obviously we still have some work to do because this is pretty ugly. But before we do that, let's go ahead and save it. And let's go ahead and hop back into a right view. Now, as I mentioned, I mean, we're coming up on an hour on this. So I think what's probably the best thing for us to do is let's fix the fender flare. Let's fix this flare area and let's get the geometry looking a bit better. And that's probably where we're going to end this video, and we can carry on replicating more of it in another video. But I'm going to start by taking these edges, and actually I'm going to break this up and start moving these edges over. So I'm going to go from here straight up and straight over, and then I'm going to delete that one. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to come roughly straight up and straight over, and then delete that one. I am going to repeat that. This is where it gets a little tricky because now we're going to end up creating some star points over here. and we're going to have to move those around. But let's go up and over here. Remember that when we're doing this, when we're inserting edges in the simple insertion mode, we're creating a flat, and that is not a good solution. So we want to make sure that we do take care of that. I'm going to select those two edges, and I'm just going to move them up a little bit. And usually moving those up just a little bit, I'm going to change this back to Windows Select. Moving those up just a little bit is oftentimes enough to get that curvature back. Now, if you leave them flat, what's going to end up happening is the geometry that you get in the smooth is going to have this sort of weird bump or this weird shape in it. So everything looks okay there. Probably is going to need a little bit more work. You can see that in the smooth display, this is pretty bad. It's something we'll have to fix it. All right, so I think what I want to do is I'm going to try to go into weld vertices. I'm going to pull this vertex down to this one and say, okay, that makes this four-sided, this four-sided. And what I want to do is I want to carry those four-sided patches around so that I can move these star points away. I really don't want triangles or star points right next to this geometry. So I'm going to go into, let's say, insert edge. I'm going to take this one, this one, this one, and this one here. And I'm going to put them relatively close. We're going to repeat that. We're going to do it here, here. It's not going to let us go past that star point, so we're only going to be able to do those two. And we'll say OK. And then we're going to use insert edge one more time. We're going to try it down here. And we'll put them roughly the same spacing. And then we're going to use insert point to connect these two. Now you might be thinking to yourself, we just made a triangle. Why would we go through all that work to make a triangle? Well, that's because we're going to take this vertical edge here and we're going to delete it. We're going to go to weld vertices and we're going to move that down to here. We still have a triangle right now. We have a star point where we've got 5 edges intersecting, but we've moved it one set of faces away from where our geometry is. So when we take a look at this in a smooth display, what we've done is we've moved that away from where we have a change in curvature. You can see up here, we've got this sort of weird wrinkle, but down here, everything looks nice and smooth because we moved that star point away from the geometry we're concerned with. Up here, it's still right on the edge, so that's a problem, but that's the whole reason that we're doing this. We want to control where those triangles, where those n-gons, and where those star points are, and we want to keep them on larger, flatter faces and away from those transitions. So we're going to carry this process on, make sure nothing's selected, go to insert point, and now I'm going to try to carry this up, and I'm going to come over and down to here. And once again, we need to get rid of some of these edges. This is going to be a little bit trickier. Simply because we don't necessarily want to move that edge all the way up. We can try it. I'm going to go ahead and just insert a new edge here and delete that one. It looks like it's probably okay. And we'll do the same thing over here. We're going to go from that point to here. Delete that. And probably not ideal. We can work with that though. That looks a little bit better. I don't like the fact that we have a triangle here. That's something I want to take care of. And one of the ways that I can do that is I can carry this shape down to maintain those quads and simply get rid of that triangle. It's going to become a little bit trickier to control the body shape doing that, but again, that takes that star point and moves it away. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 edges intersecting. We've got 4 sides, 4, 4, 4 here, and we get away from having that triangle. So this is probably, again, this is one of the hardest things is because we have to spend a lot of time really thinking about those transitions. But now if I go to a smooth display and I take a look at the results, that looks pretty good. There's still some areas that we need to worry about, like up here, there's this little bit of a wrinkle that's happening. And when we take a look at this, that wrinkle is happening at that star point. So if we take a look at this, we've got 5 edges coming into one point. And that is essentially what's causing the problem. We have the same thing over here, and those are not ideal situations. So those are things that we definitely want to take care of. Let's save it real quick, and let's see if we can do any more final tweaks to potentially get rid of that star point. So one thing that we can do and we can think about is we can insert an edge from up here. I just double click that edge, and I want to put this edge somewhere right around there. And I want to get rid of, basically what I want to do is I want to take this up and over to get that star point further away. And adding this extra edge here, at least right now, because they are essentially just flat, it's going to add somewhat of a crease there. So we're starting to get that crease that we want, but we're not quite there yet. So what I really want to do is I want to focus my attention on some transitions. So I'm going to do a quick move. I'm just going to pull that up just a little bit. Again, because I want to avoid having a flat section, I don't want to just insert a simple edge and leave it, because that's not going to give us good geometry. But now what I want to do is take insert point, and I want to come from here, and I'm going to come up to there, and then get rid of this edge, and then get rid of this edge as well. So essentially we inserted an edge and we just repurposed it. And we're going to do the same thing over here. We want to get rid of that point, so we're going to come from here. We can come down to here because we've got the extra edge. I can get rid of that. I can get rid of this one and this one here. So we're keeping all quads. This one here is an n-gon, which again gets a little tricky. It's something that we need to be careful of, and we need to break this up into 4s. But let's take a look at this in smooth display. Let's hide our edges. And you can see because of that n-gon, we've got this weird wrinkle in the surface. Now, that could just be cosmetic, but the problem gets translated further down the surface. So you can kind of see it down here. Sometimes it's a graphic issue. Sometimes it is a true surface issue. But so far, I'm pretty happy with those results. This crease is obviously too tight. We're going to have to work on that. But I'm pretty happy with those results. The next thing that I want to do before I kind of move away from this, because I'm not happy with that right there, I'm going to check to see if we even need that edge. I'm going to double click this back edge and go to insert edge and put one right in the middle. Again, we have this n-gon here. We have to sort of deal with that n-gon, because it's always going to produce some problems. But we have another tool called Make Uniform. We're going to select this, and I want to pay close attention to where these edges are. We're going to go to Box Display and back to Smooth Display, and you can see how it sort of separated them back out. Now what that's actually doing is it's taking the location of all the edges in Box Display, and it's taking the Smooth Display ones and pushing them closer to that. So it gives us overall a better result, and because we're spending our time using Box Display and that's how we're modeling, the end result, even with that big n-gon there, is now nice and smooth. Everything looks nice and smooth. I don't really see any major problems. There's a weird wrinkle that's happening up there. Something we'll have to address. That is likely the case of this edge we just inserted being completely flat between those two. So if I take probably these two edges and we just move them up a little bit, give it a little bit more curvature, and we take a look, it's still there. We can always go back in and try to repair body, see if it finds any issues. It's not finding any issues. Another way that we can tell is if we go to inspect and curvature map analysis, if you are not seeing any surface irregularities, so high changes in curvature happen where that is, then it's likely just a graphics issue. And we can see this in the, when we start to use the principal max or principal min, this is essentially taking a look at the radius of curvature. There's one little thing that's happening back here all the way at the high end, but there's nothing that's popping up in that spot. So that tells me that this is a graphics issue and not an actual surface issue. Another way that we can tell that is by finishing the form and converting this to what's called a B-rep. So I'm going to hide the edges, and we can see that that issue doesn't show up there. It's not there anymore. So that does help us. That helps us understand exactly if we are dealing with an issue that we have to correct, or if it's just a graphics issue. Now, unfortunately, I've noticed those graphics issues in Fusion, but again, we can use the inspection tools and we can just convert it to double check it. All right, so the next thing for me to do from here is I'm going to hide this body, and then I'm going to go back in to edit the form. Now, the reason I hide the body is otherwise we're going to have that ghosted transparent body there. We don't want that. But now that we've hidden that, we're back in forms. We're going to do a quick save. All right, so as I mentioned, this process does take quite a while. We are relatively close to the final shape. Like you can see that we do need to make some adjustments, pull some things here. We need to maybe pull this back in, pull some of this stuff out, and then start to kind of define the extents of this fender, pull some of these edges back. And we really want to do that at this point because we don't have too many edges that it's not unmanageable to start modifying it. But we have enough that if we keep going forward, if we keep adding more detail, it's going to become harder and harder. So this is a great time to continue to add to the overall size and shape to try to, potentially roll around the front section to the grill, around the headlight opening, and then we can sort of start to finalize that shape. But at this point, I think this is a great time to stop. We've been going at this for an hour, and I know it takes quite a long time for us to do this. As I mentioned, this is the first time that I'm going through and trying to reverse engineer this fender. I think it's important that we kind of walk through it in a raw sense together, so we can find all the things that we're going to run into, the issues that we run into normally. If you try to do this on your own, I can 100% guarantee that it will never go smooth. You'll always run into a problem that you need to work around. Let's just do a quick recap before we sign off on this video to make sure that we remember the things that we did. We started off with the fender. We started off with one giant face. So we went from basically front to back to build out the overall size. We started dividing it up to get the rough shape. We began adding vertical edges, and you'll notice that at the end, I ended up deleting every other one, and simply because of the resolution of the cylinder for the flare. Now, I had 16 divisions originally. I could have added more and we could have left all of those, or we could have just gone on with 16, essentially 8 divisions on the top. But again, these are things that you run into. You might start dividing things up and realize you have too many and you need to start backing it down. And again, we really focused our attention on picking where those points are and working in the box display and not worrying too much about the smooth display. We really wanted to focus our attention on the box display. And once we started to get the overall shape of the fender, we added the cylinder and began building out the flare. And once we built out the flare shape, we then had to divide up that cylinder and we had to divide up the fender and then start to connect them together. And once we have them connected together, now we're at the point where we can start refining, adding, making sure that we're matching the overall shape of the fender and start refining some of these details. But before we refine too much, we do want to make sure that we go all the way to the extent, at least to the opening of the headlight. We want to bring this all the way down. And these transitions are going to be kind of tricky, especially for us to do in forms. Likely what we're going to do is probably build over the opening here, and that will get cut out after the fact with a sketch in Surface Tools. It could be done, but you would need so many divisions to make that happen that it's probably just not worth the hassle. So we're going to try to do our best to replicate all these shapes, but again, some of them probably are going to be better suited to surfacing. So we might end up figuring out that we're going to take this and wrap it over, or we might try to replicate this. I really, honestly, I don't know at this point, but I'm happy with the results so far. I think that this is a great starting point and it matches the shape pretty well. We still need to add another division here to get that crease in, but again, we're not going to do that until we have the overall shape. That's the point when we start adding that in. So at this stage, let's go ahead and save it. If you have any questions, obviously let me know. If you're trying to follow along and try to replicate this as well, I'd love to know how the process is going. If you're having trouble, if there was a certain area that was easier or harder than others, or something that just completely hung you up, if I can explain it in a different way or perhaps expand on it, I'm happy to do so. But at this point, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.